Christ within you. The mystery, St. Paul says, the mystery is Christ within you, the hope of the glory to come. Christ within you. This is the heart of Celtic spirituality. But as soon as we think about a mystery within us, of course, we objectify it, and it becomes something more outside of us, or something we're trying to project outside and look at. So our way into knowing this mystery is always going to be something of a dialectic or a rhythm between thinking about it, being motivated by that idea, inspired by it, being touched by it, and actually living it and allowing it to live and teach us. So there's a double movement here. And we've seen within the Celtic spiritual imagination, everything is moving, everything is alive, everything is flowing. There are no loose ends, everything is caught up and integrated, as in the great spirals and in the great illuminated manuscripts. And this is no easy task, because it means balancing and integrating continuously two aspects of knowledge, two ways of knowing, two ways of being, which don't at first easily fit together. Let's call them the contemplative and the active, or the left and the right hand parts of the brain. And we all have a tendency to allow the left-hand brain, or the Martha aspect of ourselves, the doing, the thinking, the planning, the busying side of us to predominate. That seems to be, even lazy people do that. Contemplatives are usually quite active people. If you've ever been into a really contemplative community, there's a lot of activity there. The place is well run, people are creative, there's quite a lot of interaction, and often a lot of interaction with the outside world. I remember once giving a talk, I was in New Zealand. I gave a talk in the morning at 10 o'clock, and then somewhere on a Sunday morning, and then I was going to go to visit this enclosed religious community. It's on the other side of town, not so far away, maybe a 45-minute drive. And so after the talk, we sort of wrapped up and said goodbye and had a coffee, and then got in the car and drove over to this convent. And the nuns were all behind the screen, you know, always very joyful looking, very happy, and always like a visitor. And the abbess was very welcoming, and then proceeded to tell me every word that I said during my talk, 45, an hour before. The news had flashed over. How I never discovered it, but anyway, somebody must have gone on ahead. So, contemplative, and yet it was a very joyful and a peaceful and joyful community. You can tell a truly contemplative community because they are joyful and they communicate. And they move from silence into laughter very easily. And you feel that what they're doing in a relaxed, integrated way, but they can move on to doing something quite different without missing a beat. On the other hand, you know, very and very active people. People running big corporations or running big institutions or large families and having be constantly on the move and solving the problems of daily life can do that in a very contemplative way and be present to what they're doing and somehow or other make time for those necessary moments of stillness and non-action. So it's this idea of a contemplative life and an active life is something that are, poles apart is really a dualistic illusion. There's no life that's completely contemplative in that sense, or no life that's completely active. Laziness is another question. You could be lazy, usually lazy with regard to certain things, not about everything. So we're selective about what we are lazy about. We may be lazy about taking those times of meditation, of being non-active, and we may be lazy in a more obvious sense, where we don't do our work. We can't do the work. Sometimes this isn't just a culpable sin, it may be some burden we're carrying or some dysfunction within our psyche that we can't wrestle with. So it's not a question of being guilty about it, but recognizing it. So, this central mystery of Christian faith, Christ within you, the hope of a glory to come, that's the heart of the Celtic spirituality we've been talking about, which was both, in one aspect, a very active spirituality. To go out and cut those steps into Skellig Michael and build a flat platform 700 feet on a 45-degree rock face is not exactly lazy, is it? And is that contemplative? Well, yes, it was contemplative. Did they sometimes get distracted? Yes, they probably did, and then they fell off the cliff. But and yet we know from the literature and from the spirit of the tradition that they have left us that they were deeply immersed in a stillness which was a wakeful stillness, sensitive to the beauty of creation, accepting and content with bad weather, as we would call it, and recognizing the movement of life and the presence of the source of life in the smallest details of their own bodies or their own perceptions and of the external world. So, how do we come to that happy human condition? Because we're not talking about spiritual mastery or becoming a spiritual giant. There's no success in the spiritual life, except for people who write books about it. And the first thing you have to get rid of if you want to develop a serious practice of meditation is the idea of success. You have to, usually what we have to do is get rid of the idea of failure, which is where we get discouraged most often. And we use this feeling of failure as an excuse for being lazy or evasive about those times of meditation, the times of the inner work. Interesting that this tradition of meditation always speaks about meditation as a work. The Cloud of Unknowing speaks about the time of the work. So, in order to get into the rhythm of the practice and blend that rhythm with the rhythm of other daily responsibilities, whether it's cutting steps into a rock in the middle of the Atlantic, or whether it's raising a family or running an institution, something is needed. Something is needed. It's the same challenge, and it's about human flourishing. It's not about becoming a spiritual master. That's an ego projection onto what is essentially an ego-transcending work. Very clever little trick. The ego will prevent itself being transcended because it turns the ego-transcending work into an egotistical activity. And it will hide very, very, very subtly, at least to the person who is the victim of it, within the work. It becomes a religious ego or a spiritual ego. Religious egos are not so bad, they're not very different from corporate egos. People who invest themselves in the institution and the power structures. The more dangerous and unpleasant type is the spiritual ego. And we're all, to some degree, tempted by that, as Jesus was when we look at the temptation in the desert. And this was the temptation that the Desert Fathers and the Celtic monks were most attuned to. They dealt with most of the other temptations and distractions. Or they had recognized them, they were out there, they were working with them, they could identify the patterns of their own minds, they knew when they were being greedy, they knew when they were being lustful, they knew when they were angry. And they recognized these psychological mental states, and they worked with them with the help of their soul friend, the Ahamkara, and their rule of life. But the one temptation that they were most frightened of was spiritual pride. Because any sense of being successful in what you're doing runs the danger of undermining the whole enterprise. And it's like having somebody in your accounts department who is producing good books, but actually is siphoning all the money off into a separate account somewhere, and one day the whole company will collapse. So, now this, what does this mean? Does it mean we can never recognize that we're making some progress? No, obviously not. We do and can see the fruits of meditation in our daily life. We can recognize we're becoming a little more patient, a little more loving. We're finding joy within ourselves and within simple things rather than having to run around the world spending a lot of money or doing exotic things or taking exotic substances or in order to be happy. And we can recognize that these fruits are appearing, and if we genuinely recognize them, we give the credit to God, not to ourselves, as the traditional language. We praise God. In other words, we recognize that this is the divine life, the Spirit growing, expanding within us, and changing us and pushing the realm of shadows further and further to the edges, until eventually all will be enlightened, all will be light. It takes a long time. There's always a little pocket of darkness that's ready to trap us, but gradually we see this expansion of the spiritual life, or the life of the Spirit, and we know that it deeply implicates us, because it teaches us that this is our purpose, actually. We have a sense, people will say meditation gives me a sense of coming home. Well, it's because we have a sense that we are in touch with a fundamental reason for our existence. We don't have to run around looking for just self-justification outside. I remember when I went to university, I wanted to change, in my first term, I wanted to change from history to English. And at Oxford it was quite difficult to do, to change your subject. But I felt very intense and strong about it. And I remember talking about it with Father John, and he said, well, it doesn't really matter too much which you do, because that's not what I wanted to hear. And I ignored it. But he made the point, which I have remembered to this day, which is really it doesn't matter so much what you do. What matters is that what you're doing is producing, is part of an integrated lifestyle and so on, that is producing fruits. And is helping you to grow in this awareness of your ultimate purpose and destiny, divinization, becoming God. And I did change, and it was a good thing to change. And I was much happier, I think. But the other is also true. If I hadn't been able to change, I would have to just reconcile myself to being a historian and enjoying that. Hopefully I would have enjoyed it. Anyway, the point being that we need, and what the Celtic monks and the whole monastic tradition that comes from the desert, and indeed the universal monastic tradition reminds us is that we need a what should we say, a system, or we need a mechanism or a practice that will allow this work to unfold as smoothly and as happily as possible, and this is what they call asceticism. In his first conference, Cassian says, what is the goal of a monk? And he says, and by monk here, we're not looking at these superheroes or stars of the spiritual galaxy who are so different from us. If we're meditating, we're in the same boat as them. If we have a serious practice, or we're trying to maintain a serious practice, we are monks. Remember, St. Benedict says a monk is simply someone who truly seeks God. So we can't evade our own challenge or our own potential by just sort of saying, well, these are the spiritual warriors, and I just bathe and bask in their reflected glory. Okay, so the ultimate goal of the monk's life is the kingdom of God. But then he says that may seem a little abstract or a little far away, and so we need an immediate goal, a daily goal, and that is purity of heart. Remember the Beatitude, happy are the pure of heart, for they shall see God. And the asceticism of that form of Christian life is specifically designed to purify the heart. And what does that mean? It means to withdraw our projections, as we've been describing. It means seeing things as they really are, rather than seeing them through the filter of our own minds. It's about cleansing the doors of perception so we can see things as they truly are. And just as we're cleaning windows or cleaning anything, you have to continually clean it. I just saw actually the other day the great symbol of this was the Forth Bridge up in Scotland, which I think was built in 1880 or something. And it's until this year, the painting of the bridge was a continuous operation. It was always being painted. By the time we got to one end, the other end was needed to be redone. So it was an expression in English, painting. It's like painting the Forth Bridge. In other words, you're never finished with it. Actually, this year they've now developed a super resilient paint, which means they don't have to do it so often. But anyway, so but generally, certainly the level of the human mind, this cleansing operation is continuous. We need a regular and continuous practice, otherwise the windows get dirty. And it's very funny, as the windows get dirty in your home, slowly, if somebody came and sprayed manure all over it from the outside, you would know immediately they were dirty. But day by day, the grime builds up, and you don't realize it until one day it's a beautiful sunny day outside, and you come indoors and you don't feel that sunlight in the house, and then you realize it's time to clean the windows, and then you are amazed at how full of light and clarity it is. So this is the purpose of asceticism. It comes from a word in Greek that was that referred to athletic training. So the All-Ireland final yesterday was a group of our athletic stars or gods, who, and the Irish game, Irish football is shorter than a regular soccer match, isn't it? Yes. By about half an hour, because it's a very fast-moving game, and it must be quite exhausting. And I'd imagine you really have to be in good condition to do well at it. And I think one of the reasons we deify our sporting heroes is because they are symbols for us. Maybe not of moral excellence or of great, cultural achievements or so on, but they are symbols for us of ascetical discipline and seriousness and love. That these young athletic heroes are people who make huge sacrifices of time and maybe even of career. They have short careers when they become sports commentators. And yet we admire their dedication. And in the same way, I think the early church looked at the monks of the desert, or the Celtic monks, and the Irish church still has this great veneration, much more than the English church, for the monastic heritage. Because these were models, or symbols of an asceticism, commitment to training, getting out there and doing it even when you didn't feel like doing it, and self-control, because you can't smoke, you have to be careful of what you eat, and you have to do regular exercise. And so that's asceticism at the physical level, sporting level. Now, we can lie on the couch with a beer and some chips and watch these ascetical athletic heroes, or we can be inspired by them to get ourselves in shape and remain in good condition spiritually as well as physically. In the very early period of Christianity, asceticism was not related to monasticism. Ascetics, in other words, people who wanted to really train in the spiritual life, stayed at home and just said, I'm going to live a certain way and devote myself to prayer and control certain aspects of my life that need to be under control, or in their local church. And we see this phenomenon of human asceticism way back in history. Even before monasticism developed, and every major civilization has produced a form of monasticism. But even before monastic life developed, we have evidence of the ascetical life In India, for example, you remember an early stage in the Buddha's life was when he was in search of enlightenment, and he joined a band of ascetics who were extreme self-deniers of food and so on, and he became almost like a skeleton. And there's a certain motif of Buddha statues where he looks like a corpse, but he's actually just very thin, like a sort of a supermodel. And and then he realized, well, okay, this is giving me a lot of interesting states of mind, and maybe has sharpened my perceptions, but have still not enlightened. What I want is enlightenment, not just, mental psychedelics. And what is enlightenment? Well, enlightenment is the loving integration of our whole being and our tying up all the loose ends so that our beginning and our end is the same in God. So he left the ascetical group, and then they made fun of him and rejected him because he was too moderate and was eating normally and so on. There's an exchange in the Gospel when the Pharisees say to Jesus, John's disciples, John was an ascetic, wasn't he? John the Baptist, living in the desert, locusts and wild honey. And the Pharisees said, John's disciples, they were fasting, they were living, they were good ascetics. And do you remember Jesus' response to that?
Surely you do not expect the bridegroom to be, while the bride is still with him? But the bridegroom is still with them?
Well, the friends, not the bride and the bridegroom. It's the friends of the bridegroom, yes.
Not fast when the bride.
Yes, you don't fast while the, yes, you don't. If you're going to a wedding party, you start your diet the next day. And we see this in all the major religious traditions. This phenomenon of physical and mental asceticism. But when Christian monasticism developed in just the third, fourth centuries, asceticism was part of that, but in a way it was moderated by it. We don't think of the Celtic monks as being very moderate. St. Benedict was much more moderate, for example, than St. Columban. St. Columban, one of the great Irish saints who died in the year that who was born in the year that St. Benedict died. His rule of life, all these monastic leaders wrote little rules of life, was much stricter and more physically demanding than Benedict's. Benedict was a great editor. 90% of the rule of St. Benedict is not original. And most of its unique spirit is the result of editing out things and some small degree of original input. But the characteristic of Benedict's editing of the monastic tradition, what makes him original, although he wasn't trying to be original, was the moderation of these ascetical practices. St. Columban is quite even now though, when people read the rule of St. Benedict, for the first time as they're going to become oblates, sometimes they get turned off because it seems too harsh. But if you read the rule of St. Columban, you think the rule of St. Benedict was a holiday camp. Columban has a list of penitential practice, penitential punishments really for rather small offences. You get 50 lashes. So how that was lived out, we don't know, but the spirit of it anyway seems to us much more extreme. But in general, even taking that, taking that on board, monasticism seemed to develop in order to provide a moderating and integrating and balancing context for the asceticism, the training, the exercise that we all need in order to play a good game of life. Pachomius was the great monk of the Egyptian desert who wrote the first rule for a common life. So it seems as if as more people were attracted towards the ascetical life, they found ordinary church life a little too kind of institutional, maybe a bit superficial, not giving them the inspiration or the means for going deeper, as we would say today, or living the gospel with sufficient seriousness. And as more and more people reacted against the tepidity, the lukewarmness of the institutional church, this is the usual way we express it, then they started to come into the desert, because where all these great spiritual athletes had quietly and modestly gone, with no intention of attracting disciples or a crowd. And Pachomius was the first of these desert monks to form a common life, because, you know, the more people you have, the more levels of practice you're going to have. You know, somebody can come sincerely seeking God, but, you know, has a lot more problems to deal with at first than others. Others come and they slip right into it. Others come, and Thomas Merton said, you know, when he was reflecting on the inadequacy of contemporary monastic life for meeting the spiritual needs of the modern world, and he said, you know, what's the point in having a monastery today? He said, in this way, the way we're running it. He said, when, you know, the young Americans who come to join, you know, spend 2 years overcoming their addiction to television. You know, this is, and other sort of social conditions. According to Origen, great 2nd century father of the church, in his understanding of the spiritual life, conversion begins for everyone when you realize that you are a child of God, and also that the real world is the interior world. So that may be something to reflect on. Obviously we have to understand what, for us anyway, child of God means. What does it mean to recognize that you are a child of God? Some people don't like God, don't want to be a child of God. They want to be a child of themselves. They want to work out their own salvation with diligence. Do it on my own with a little help from some consultants. But I think that the first step of the 12-step program is such a spiritual step, recognizing that we cannot do this on our own resources, but we have to throw ourselves open to grace. Maybe there's some way of understanding the humility, and also the intimacy, or the opening of the heart to another. How can we become humble without having encountered another and opened ourselves to another with the risk and the honesty and the humility that's necessary for that. So maybe there's some meaning there in child of God. And understanding that the real world is the inner world. Well, as we did that little practice in the meditation walk just now, what is inner and what is outer? So we see this asceticism as part of the Christian and very strongly in the Celtic monastic tradition. But we have to translate that into terms of our own lifestyle and of our contemporary world. We know that Jesus went into the desert, and as St. Mark says, was with the wild beasts. You could get a little glimpse there of the Celtic ascetical practice of solitude, of being in nature and allowing nature to be in you, and allowing therefore your own true nature to be awakened and enlightened. Muhammad actually, surprisingly, had quite a ascetical side to him. He said in one of his sayings, "What have I to do with worldly things? My connection with the world is like a traveller resting for a while underneath the shade of a tree and then moving on." He lived a very simple life, even when he'd become most powerful, almost like the king of Arabia. He's lived a very ascetical, physically ascetical life. Well, as did Hitler, for that matter. Or as did Gandhi, for that matter. So asceticism is, the purpose of asceticism is not an end in itself. And that's the wisdom of the monastic tradition, to recognize the need for a good training and regular exercise and keeping yourself in condition and not eating bad food. I mean this both mentally, psychologically, as well as spiritually. But at the same time recognizing that this ascetical practice needs to be contained in some kind of human moderating structure, probably itself culturally conditioned, although monasticism is like meditation itself, is a transcultural phenomenon. I think I'll just finish here. Well, if the purpose of asceticism then is to purify the heart, to bring us to purity of heart, we need a rule, we need human relationships, companions for the way, we need people with whom we can be completely open. The trap of spiritual practice is spiritual pride, and the trap of the monastic structure is you just become an isolated automaton, actually escaping from contact with real people and escaping from real relationship, and actually using the structures to move through life in a sort of sealed compartment. Well, you don't have to go to a monastery to do that, but that is the danger of it. And I think any form of spirituality in any tradition can generate that kind of self-encapsulating and basically ego-driven illusion. It's a big danger, but then everything carries that danger with it. And therefore, I think we see beautifully in the Celtic tradition, but I think in practice in the Benedictine tradition too, that even the monastery and the monk was part of society, even though maybe in different parts of the margins of society economically. And therefore monks and marriage had a very strong, mutually reinforcing relationship. And we see it in the structure of the Celtic monastery, with families and married couples and monks and ascetics and people and hermits and those living in community together. And I think the danger of marriage and raising a family and having a career is that you assume, or you think you don't have time for your spiritual practice. The danger of the monastery is that you retreat into personal isolation, and your spiritual practice doesn't actually lead to transformation. It just becomes a routine, but a kind of a sterile and sometimes even an inhumane routine. So there are dangers in any way of life, and the best way of combating these dangers is to mingle the way of life. And what is happening in our era is very interesting. We see religion changing immensely, religious institutions going through major changes. We see the Dalai Lama of Tibet speaking the other day in Brazil about affirming the secular and saying that secularism does not mean, as some religious people think, a rejection of religion, but it's simply a new relationship of religion to society, and particularly of the relationship of different religions to each other. And so we're living in a secular age. It doesn't mean we're living in a non-spiritual age. Secularism doesn't necessarily mean materialism, but it is a new era of religious consciousness, and takes big institutions some time to adjust to that, and in fact it won't be the institutions that do the adjusting, it will be the people within the institutions that change. And what we see happening is a flowering of that inner life that the Celtic monks were so intense about and so much in love with. And in meditation, which has hit the mainstream of our culture now for a while, remains to be seen how the media deal with it. The media have given it its moment on, front stage, but the media is not a very good medium for communicating serious information or serious insights. Nevertheless, it can change some superficial perceptions, and generally the perception of meditation has changed quite dramatically in 10 years even, maybe even less. And so we can see that in this new religious consciousness, which is emerging from modern crisis, that meditation is on the table, and it's presented to us universally. You don't have to be a monk or an ascetic, a professional ascetic, in order to meditate. You could meditate and be running a major financial institution or raising a large family. And that, I think, that takes us really to the heart of what we're looking at in the Celtic imagination and in the Celtic spirituality. And a time of retreat like this is a time for us to clarify that, to see what is our own asceticism, what is our own practice, and and what is appropriate for us at the age we're at, perhaps, or in the way of life we're living, or in the next stage of life that we are preparing for, or that is preparing us. In the light of all these personal and particular aspects, what is the best ascetical practice for me? And if I'm serious about that, as those monks were obviously very serious, and it's inspiring that we do see people who are serious about their training, if I'm serious about it in my own way, then what do I need to maintain that? And to avoid the inherent dangers of isolation or pride. And what is the goal? If the goal is purity of heart in my day-to-day practice, my day-to-day training, don't lose sight of the ultimate goal, the kingdom of God. Okay, just a question here. Well, rather complicated statement, really. I'm not sure, but is a haiku not longer than you are suggesting, and determined by the number of syllables? Well, I don't know what that means. I always forget, but I think it is, as you then go on to say, e.g. the C sound has 17 syllables. Is it 17 or 19? 17. Okay, so there's 17 syllables. I think that's the form. The number was predetermined. And then, this must have been written by an Irish meditator. An Irish haiku, that is the 17th of March, St. Patrick's Day. The 17th of March? No, it doesn't. Are you sure you're not thinking of the Zen koan, which is much shorter but also has a discipline of pre-intentional number of syllables? Well, I don't know. A haiku is an expert in Japanese literature, but a haiku is a 3-line poem with 17 syllables with a very concrete image. A koan is a tradition of riddles which are designed to give the mind something to focus on, to wrestle with, and to bring the mind beyond its own cognitive and rational operations. So what is the sound of one hand clapping? Go away and think of that for a week. And you come back to your Zen master and you say, I got it. The sound of one hand clapping is, and then he belts you around the face and you go off for another week. Or what do you do when you meet the Buddha on the road? Kill him. Or the famous koan of Irish dairy farmers, moo. So I think they're different, really. The haiku is in a lyrical tradition, really. So it's expressive, whereas and uses is more cataphatic, which means using words and images to evoke the experience of the spirit, whereas the koan is more apophatic because it quietens, it stills the mind, and eventually brings the mind to a still point where it says, I don't know, or there is no answer to this, or it brings you to that sort of cliff edge of thought and language, and then to a new level of insight. So, anyway, I'm not going to count the number of syllables. These are really very, very nice and interesting and nice to read each other's insights like this.